Okay, so moving on to item E2, which is the recommended approval of the 2021 first interim budget report. This is our large item for this evening, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to staff to start us off with some information.
Well, thank you so much. Tonight, as Shelley said, Chris will be providing an overview of our first interim budget of the 21-22 school year. But before I turn it over to him, I would just like to acknowledge the amazing effort that Chris makes every day, all day on behalf of the district, and how lucky we are to have him as our chief business official. So, and I think in light of what we're going to be learning and hearing more about tonight, that will be made completely clear as to why I'm acknowledging Chris in that way. And so since learning 2 weeks ago, after an inquiry to MCOE about the Lcff Calculator that was provided for our first interim budget, he learned that the Lcff Calculator that MCOE provided for the 21-22 adoption, which you all did back in June, showed that the district was moving to basic aid status, but they forgot to remove the ERAF, or the Educational Revenue Augmentation Funds, in 22-23, which resulted in showing that the district was then back out of basic aid status for the multi-year projections. So when they corrected that error, which is fantastic, and since that date, we have been working in overdrive to understand the impact of moving to community funded or basic aid status beginning next school year, as well as to make revisions to our budget projections. This updated information, of course, has affected the district in a multitude of ways. So as if we had had the information back in May or June, we would have had 7 or more months to be able to plan and project outward. Yeah. And so Chris and I have spent an amazing amount of time with support to learn as much as we can. We're very thankful for that support. And we know that being said, we have had a basic understanding of what community funded or basic aid status means for districts. This will be the first time that Ross Valley School District has ever been in basic aid status. And we also know that there are some short as well as some long-term considerations that still need to be unpacked. And we know that as a school staff, as a school district, and as a school community, we all are going to be very interested in learning more, and we'll need to share the information more broadly with our school community, so our staff and our parents, and also just members who don't have kids in our school district. So the impact is big, and we're really happy here tonight to have Kate Lane, Assistant Superintendent from Business Services from Marin County Office of Education, as well as Attorney General Counsel Sue Ann Salmon Evans from Dana Swallifer and Kelly to answer any questions that the trustees may have, and to help present and to unload or unpack this news for us. So Chris has, in the last 2 weeks, done an amazing job with taking our adopted budget and then with the new revised information, be able to then project out. And so this presentation is quite dense. It's a lot of information that has to be provided here. So we want to make sure that we have enough time, as well as to be able to answer any questions trustees have. So with that, I want to welcome Kate and Sue Ann, and go ahead, Chris, take it away.
Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the first interim budget. And I'm going to have to talk louder. I have a tendency to talk quietly, so I apologize. So whenever we look at our budgets, the very first thing that we always need to think about is, what is our enrollment? And the reason for that is our attendance is based upon our enrollment. And it's a percentage of how many kids we have enrolled. And so looking at our enrollment trend since 2014-15, what we've seen is a pretty steep drop in our enrollment. At one point we were at 23-20. We did see a small increase in the following year, but then since then what we've seen is a drop in our enrollment. As you recall, at our last board meeting, we went through some data for the county and for the state as a whole. in terms of what they expect the enrollment numbers for the county and the state to look like as we move forward. And what we would anticipate is continued downward trends of that information. The other thing that I want to point out with this slide is that we did have, within our budget, our adopted budget, we showed a number of 1764 anticipated enrollment, and which was, we were keeping it flat compared to what we had last year. And the reason for that is we were anticipating receiving back a number of our kids from the previous year that had left as a result of the COVID shutdown.
Mm-hmm.
And while our numbers were really close to that, when we got our CBEDS data, it was, which is our the first Wednesday in October, when we count the actual enrollment, that's what the CBEDS date is, and our actual number was 1756. And so it's slightly lower than what you had been given. And as a result of that, we did make some minor modifications as well to our enrollment moving forward in those out years. And we do expect enrollment numbers to continue to decline. When looking at our 2021-22 fiscal year, these are our revenues. This is just a pie chart of the total general fund. And the reason this is important is because although we have $28,208,000, which you should see up there in the top left, what really stands out to you is that the local control funding formula, LCFF, is the single largest source of income for the Ross Valley School District. It's 62% of our total revenues. And when looking at our parcel tax, which thankfully the voters of Ross Valley have approved for a number of years now, that is 15%. So absent those two, we have very small dollar amounts in terms of federal, state, lottery, special ed. And the other thing that is of note, of importance, is the YES program, which is up there.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are dollars that are our foundation here in the Ross Valley School District donates back to the district for things such as arts and music and other programs in that respect. So we're very thankful for all they do for the district as well. The next slide here is our expenses in the general fund. And the reason that we want to keep this in the forefront is because although we have $27.6 million shown in total general fund expenses, the single largest source of expenses that we have, and this is in every single district, is salaries and benefits. We are a people industry. We're here to serve the children and the community of the Ross Valley School District. And so it makes sense that people are our single largest expense, and you see it play out with 80% of our expenses in the general fund. And then you have books and supplies, and you have services and other expenses, and those pretty much round out the largest sources of expenses that the district sees. When looking at our 2021 fiscal year, looking at our adopted budget to first interim, this is our basically what you would consider to be like your income statement if you're a private organization. And you'll see that we show an increase in our total general fund between adopted and first interim. Looking at the bottom, we were showing $5,000 roughly excess, and now it's $608. And we have some reasons for that. A lot of it has to do with things such as COVID dollars that we got in. And so we might have those dollars and reflect them as revenues and carry over those balances to spend them over multiple years. And so that's part of what you see in there. And looking at it, the other thing that's of importance and note is if you look at our salaries and benefits, you'll see that there is a decrease in our salaries and benefits of $197,000. And the bulk of that is for the human resources reorganization that we've done, where we've eliminated the director. And so you'll note that those changes are in there. So when looking at our total general fund, those are within the current fiscal year, those are your major changes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there was Marcy talked about quickly our Lcff Calculator, And so just to kind of talk about it very quickly, in June, we did have our Lcff Calculator. We always get for every budget period, an Lcff Calculator from the County Office of Ed. And we also do it on our side, and we kind of compare them and have conversations and things. But when we looked at it in 2021, the 22-23 fiscal year and the 23-24 continued to include our ERAP funds. And had those been excluded at that particular time, it does show that we would have flipped over into basic aid status at that point, or community funded status. In mid-November, we got the updated, which is every budget period we get an updated Lcff Calculator, and there were some changes made to the property taxes, which happens generally once the County of Marin does their thing. They provide updated information based upon how they have put up the property taxes for the first November period. And so you see that was updated, and at that time the county gave it to us, and it was flipped. The ERAP funds were pulled out, and it did show that we flipped into basic aid status for the last 2 fiscal years. And then as we started to really unpack that, because it's a lot to think about, there were some questions, and what we realized is that we still needed to pull additional dollars out of the calculations. And that has to do with charter in lieu of property tax. And what that means is that if we have a charter school that is approved at the state level, which we do have one that we are aware of at this particular point in Ross Valley School District, we would then have to, if we're in basic aid status for those fiscal years, we would have to pay for the Ross Valley students that are going to Ross Valley Charter, for example, in this particular case. We would have to pay basically what would it amount to their local control funding formula, so that the state doesn't have to provide that state aid. And so that's the purpose of that payment, because we would be getting those dollars in terms of property taxes. And so once we were able to kind of look at that data along with the County Office of Education, we did make an adjustment to it in terms of our numbers. And what we did is made those adjustments and built our budget based upon those calculations. And it was approximately 122 students. And since then, we've received some updated information from the charter school through the County Office of Education. And I think for the P1 attendance report, they're showing 123. So it's really close. So, I feel good about that part of it. But we'll have to kind of take a look and see what it means in terms of the breakdown of the students, because that also does play a part in how that the in lieu property tax dollars get calculated, because there's a higher revenue amount that we would have to pay towards the charter for your TK through 3rd grade, and then 4th through, in their case, it's 5th grade. So there's some minor nuances. We'll have to take a look at that. But for the most part, I think our numbers are pretty close. And going back, I know that on April 22nd, we did a governing board budget workshop. And we did talk about basic aid status, because there's so many districts in the county that are basic aid, so everybody's always asking, can't you just go to basic aid status? Well, we showed this, and it talks about the property taxes and how you fall into basic aid status once your property taxes exceed your Lcff entitlement amount, which is your Lcff entitlement is basically taking your attendance times the Lcff amount per student, calculating your total number of Lcff revenues, and that's your entitlement. So if your property taxes are greater than that, it spills over and you're into basic aid status. That's in a nutshell what it is, and I know that we had talked about it, so just wanted to bring that forward.
And I think now, learning that we, at least at this time, it does look like we're projected to be in community funded or basic aid status next year. That's a very much of an oversimplification about how the revenues and the information is calculated. And so that's been part of our huge learning over the past 2 weeks is really digging in and learning a lot more about what does all this mean. It's not that simple.
Speaking of which.
There you go. Well, I like better the previous image. It was very simple. Now it's like I'm all confused.
So there's a lot of information on this particular slide. I want to point first of all to the bottom section, and I want to highlight that first because there's a lot of good in going into community fund. You do get more money than if you are an LCFF state aid funded district because it is generally more. It doesn't have to even be a lot. It could be $1 more, but it is more. But it isn't necessarily what you think it is. And what do I mean by that? If you look at the middle column for each of those fiscal years, you'll see that at the very top where it says total LCFF revenues, and you see the red circles. The first red circle to the left is our first interim budget for 21-22, and you'll see it's $17.4 million. And at adopted, we had $17,401,000, very small change, which we talked about, minus $3,900. If you look at our 22-23 year, you'll see that it went from 15.46 to 17.3. So it's an increase of $1.8 million. Now, that is a lot of money, but it's also a large portion of that is one-time in nature. We have, and Kate did a really good job explaining some of this to me in terms of the other state, other, I'm blanking out on the term.
Well, that's why Katie's here.
Yeah,
That's the one
the supplemental property taxes. The supplemental property.
Supplemental taxes. There's a lot of moving parts to the LCFF.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's the supplemental property taxes. And so we get those supplemental property taxes in year one of entering basic aid status, but you don't get it moving forward, so you pull it out. The other thing that happens is we don't pay the in lieu property taxes in year one of the entering
New status.
the basic aid status, but you have to pay it in year two. So when you have both of those removed or put into your figures for the 23-24 year, what you see is your revenues actually drop down to $15.8 million. And so although basic aid status is a good thing, it doesn't solve the problem, which is that you go from 17.4 in the left all the way down to $15.8 million. It doesn't solve the entire issue.
So they're still declining. It's still declining.
It's still declining. It's just
in a
not
different
quite as fast.
And your 23-24, if I was looking into 24-25 and the next few years, the years are going to look more like 23-24. They're never going to look like 22-23. 22-23 is a one-off.
Unless you flip in and out of basic aid status.
And that I want to have,
except
except if you.
Let's
Okay, let's hold
keep
on this
that
question.
correct. Keep it. Write it down.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
I have
so-
many questions.
Just to kind of show you the complexities of the calculations as well, when looking at your property taxes, so look at the yellow section below that 17,317,000.
Yeah.
You'll see that we have property taxes of $15.3 million. Well, looking to the left of it, we were showing 9.4. Why is that? The biggest source of that is because ERAF is actually a negative property tax to school districts. It's in essence, it's a contra revenue. And so what the state does is they take the property tax from us and give it back to us in the form of state aid. And so the minute you enter basic aid status, if you haven't pulled it out, then you see what's on the left. When you pull it out, it looks like what's in that yellow section where you no longer have the ERAF funds being pulled out. And then the other side of that, if you kind of drop down to the next section below, you see EPA funds and other state aid. you'll see for the adopted budget in 22-23, it's 5.7 million. That's other state aid. That's made up of, the bulk of it is your ERAF funds, but there's also some other funds that are built into it, and you have your EPA. Now, we just mentioned that earlier, and I know Marcy was saying that those buckets are an oversimplification, where you see that $1.6 million in the middle column, all the way at the bottom. That's part of that oversimplification. We still will receive some form of state aid, but what that state aid will be is the guaranteed portion for like programs, categorical funds that were rolled into the LCFF at one point. Things, if I'm not mistaken, like EIA and some of the others.
Yeah, 40 different categorical
Yeah.
programs that were eliminated with the change in the funding formula to the local control funding formula. So it's a long list. EPAs, economic impact aid, EIA is probably one of
Yeah.
the largest in there.
And so the other thing that is really important to note, if you look at the 23-24 year, that middle column, what you'll see is our total LCFF revenues are $15.8 million. And if you look down to the property taxes, they're down to the below the yellow section, you'll see $13.9 million. Part of that is we're paying the in lieu property taxes, so it reduces that. But we're still in basic aid status, and our property taxes now are less than the LCFF. And that's because we still have the other state aid that's coming in and the EPA. And so within the Lcff Calculator, there's some complexities, and that's one of them. And so to kind of drive home that point, you see that in, okay, so this is just kind of an oversimplification of what those 2 years would look like. If we were a state aid funded district, we would show up as the LCFF entitlement side. And so the total revenues for a state aid funded district in LCFF would be that green. When you look over to the 22-23, you see that it's not just your property taxes, you also have the yellow, which is other state aid, and the purple, which is your EPA funds. And so your total LCFF revenues are going to be the total amount. And you really see it in going to the 23-24 fiscal year. You see that the LCFF entitlement is greater than the property taxes. However, as you start to add in those other things, it's now higher. So you get the greater of those two. And so at this particular point, it would look like it that we would be in LCF. I'm sorry, we would be in basic aid status in 23-24 as well. So now, when looking at our total general fund, this is kind of a snapshot of what our ending fund balances would look like. And you see in here our beginning balance, our revenues and expenses, and what the net increase is. Now, this is total general fund within the balances, but what I've done is listed the unrestricted reserve percentage in those other numbers. And the other thing that I want to point out is these are where we stand today. They also don't take into consideration any potential salary settlements that might be happening or take place in the future. So that's important to note. It's just kind of a point to ponder. One thing that is also of great importance when looking at if you're a community funded district or a state aid funded district, although there's a 3% required minimum reserve for a district of our size, regardless of the funding status, generally speaking, you see districts with higher reserves that are state aid funded, because what we haven't talked about is the negative impacts on the cash flow. And that's because we would be getting the property taxes, the bulk of our money in terms of property taxes, and we'd have less and less state aid. The state aid gets split over the year, where the property taxes are primarily in 2 months.
Yeah.
And so it does create a negative. And then you amplify that with us, with a large portion of our property taxes also having to be paid out in lieu of property taxes, charter in lieu property taxes. So we would also be paying that in line with the monthly payments that we would normally expect to get if we were state aid. And so one of the things that, you know, we haven't had a chance to really digest everything, so we do have lots of questions that we are just kind of throwing out there, and it's just things that we know that we need to keep in mind. Things such as we move into basic aid community funded status, and also if we potentially would flip back and forth between them, and there's reasons we might. So things like, what are the impacts of the Lcff Calculator based on any changes to the COLA? So as the COLA changes, that changes your entitlement. That could push you in and out of community aid status. And so that's something really important we need to be thinking of. How are above items interrelated with average daily attendance? Because as your average daily attendance goes, so too does your entitlement. So if your enrollment goes up along with your ADA, then your entitlement will go up. If we continue as expected to start to see declines in our enrollment and ADA, then our entitlement would actually go down. So there's a lot of interconnectivity. What is the impact with changes in total property taxes? And we're talking dollars. So whatever the housing market does in our area has a direct impact now upon this status. If the change in impact in property taxes is larger than the COLA that comes out, that will have a direct impact. If it's less than that cost of living adjustment, then that would have an impact. So we have to look at it in that respect. How does the elimination of supplemental taxes in year 2 of community funded status impact total revenues? And we talked about that briefly, and it's, you know, we have to look at that total dollar amount, and, you know, if we're flipping back and forth, what does that look like? And I know that right now we're saying that we don't have to pay it, but I don't know the intricacies. As we talked about, we oversimplify basic aid status with the buckets, but is there something in regulation that, you know, if you're switching in and out, do you not get it? We still have to kind of unpack all of that. How does RVSD switch from state subsidized to community funded structure impact the excess ERAF calculation? Since there would be fewer districts and or students in the ERAF calculation. One of the major drivers of those ERAF funds to begin with has to do with if you're in basic aid status, you do not have ERAF taken from your funds, but if you do, if you are state aid, you do have ERAF. Well, now Rock Valley flips into basic aid status, we no longer have ERAF. That will negatively impact Novato Unified as well as San Rafael Elementary School District. Those are the last 2 districts in the county that would not be community aid funded. However, I'm sorry, that are not community aid funded, that are state aid. But there's an excess amount of ERAF funds that there's some debate over how to spend those or how to divvy them up, and there's actually some litigation on that. And actually, that's our next question. Kind of moving to community aid funded status, will the current lawsuit between CSBA and Betty Yee, will that impact us? So those are things that I don't know how that would unpack.
I can tell you how that would You need patience, and you need to be able to understand Rube Goldberg.
Yeah.
So it's all about how you treat charters, and quite frankly, that lawsuit is a misunderstanding on the part of CSBA as to how ERAF is calculated in the 5 excess ERAF counties in regards to paying charters. So
Let's definitely, I think when we come to, I'm super glad you're hearing all this so that we can dive into a lot of all of that with you, definitely.
And some of it you might be able to answer tonight, and some of it, a lot of it will probably come back
Yeah.
I'll be sitting at your desk, I'm sorry.
It will be good.
Yeah, and so there's other things in here like how do community-funded districts prepare for fiscal impacts as we have large fluctuations in our enrollment and attendance? You know, it's easy to say that when you're a declining enrollment state aid funded district, you have to make cuts, but things change as you look at those pluses and minuses when you're a community aid funded district. So there's a lot of intricacies that we'll have to be learning as we move forward. As we transition to community aid status, should RVSD continue granting inter-district attendance permits on a space available basis to students and families who reside outside of the boundaries of our district? That's one of the things that becomes
Big deal.
a big deal. And so when you're state aid, you want kids, and when you're community aid funded, it doesn't, your revenues aren't driven based upon your ADA, they're driven based on your property taxes. So how you look at it could change. And
Wow.
how does the addition of in lieu tax payments to any charter schools in year 2 of community aid fund status impact our revenues? We did talk about that a little bit,
Yeah.
but you know, which charter schools can impact us? We know of one. Are there any others that could or have the potential? You know, we talk about the timelines for our in lieu tax payments and property tax receipts, and so that it just becomes a big cash flow issue. It's something that we need to be really sitting down and when doing your cash flows as a state aid funded district, you know that you're always going to get money every month. So as you process them, they're not quite as tight as you have to make them with a state aid or a community funded district.
The saving grace for that is that here in Marin County, we have a very close relationship with the County of Marin.
Yeah, so they love the difference for the short
So we
term.
do tax anticipation notes with them. It is the cheapest form of borrowing I have ever seen. You essentially, your general fund is allowed to go negative, and you pay interest on that negative at the same rate that it's earning, which right now is way below 1%. So our relationship with the county treasury makes the cash flow implications much, much easier to deal with, but they are huge, Chris, and you're right to point those out as one of the largest impacts of flipping. And if we did not have the relationship with the county treasurer that we have here and with the county auditor and tax collector, well, I probably would have moved to Australia. So, because we've had several districts going through this, and you know, if it hits you June 30th, you can't go negative cash to close your fiscal year.
No.
So, thank God for the county of Marin.
And then you have to be able to make your monthly payroll, so you don't ever want to get into that situation as well, which is really nice.
Okay.
You don't have to look at open market debt borrowing
Yeah.
with other,
But still, you still have to borrow,
You
and
still have
that
to
costs money.
and there's it reduces
that's-
your tax revenue, your
Yep.
interest income revenues
Yep.
during that period.
Yep.
And so what are the impacts as we teeter in and out of potentially out of community funded status on those cash flow statements? We know that if we're state aid, it's split or spread in certain months, and if we are community aid funded, we get it during certain months. And so we'll have to be looking at those things in terms of our cash flow, because there's a saying, cash is king, and if you don't have the money, then you can't pay the bills. So, and then I asked a question earlier about which charters will we be responsible for providing inland property taxes? Is it just Ross Valley Charter, or are there others out there? We know that we have Heartwood, which is in the area, and then there's still other districts that have charters within the county And if we happen to have students that go to those districts, under what pretense would we have to pay?
Only
So-
have to pay in lieu taxes. If you authorize a charter, you're responsible for the entire in lieu payment for all students that attend. In this particular situation, this is a State Board of Education authorized charter. The state is responsible for funding their entire LCFF except for students that come from, that reside in basic aid districts, and they have to be districts that certified basic aid in the prior year. So there is only the Ross Valley Charter, but that is significant. None of the other charters, Nevada Charter, would not impact you. Willow Creek has gone away. And I'm not quite sure where Hartwood are at, but they're currently, aren't they, out of Sonoma or something?
They're out of Sonoma, but they also have a location out near Fairfax.
Yeah.
Let's I hope we're all writing down some additional so we can deep dive into some more of these. And just keep going through here.
Yeah, and then the last one is how do we verify student residency to confirm that we're not paying for somebody else's students?
That's a big deal. Then how does that work?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Got that.
So then, this is the same slide as before. Moving on to what it looks like in terms of our general fund again.
Yeah.
And the reason I show this is because I want to talk about our ending balances, because even though this is the general fund, not everything is the unrestricted general fund, which is really what your reserve percentage is based on. So we should understand what that is. And so these are the components of our ending balances within our, how we closed last year, how we are showing our current first interim budget for 21-22, and then the out years. And so as you look at it, what I want to point out is the revolving cash, that's just dollars that we have available should we need to make like an emergency payroll for somebody if something gets missed, that type of thing. It's a very small amount. In terms of our restricted funds are those categorical programs that we have carryover dollars on. And so you'll see that those start out with something large and they continue to go down. So what that means is that we're spending those dollars down. And then we have our state 3% required reserve, and that's based upon our total expenses in the general fund, both restricted and unrestricted. And then the next thing that we have in there is our board 7% set aside, because the governing board has made it, one of the things that we have to look at is ensuring that we always have 10% set aside, so that's the remaining 7%. And so whatever is left over goes into that amount in excess of our 10%. And so again, our total ending balance is what is shown there. And I do want to again point out that has to do with our current situation at this time and does not include any salary settlements. And we still have we have CSEA, their sunshine today, and we're still working with the teachers union. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And so as we move forward, all of those things are going to play a part in how we look at our budget moving forward. Our budget will be changing probably pretty significantly as we look at our second interim. It's possible that we could even fall out of basic aid status if there's some changes that have happened in both or one of those years. Things such as the transitory inflation impact, what is that going to do to our cost of living adjustment, the COLA? We had a 2.48% COLA shown for next year because that's what the common message is that comes down from the County Office of Education, and that all county offices of education put out so that there's comparability across the counties. And so they used the latest information we had, but there are whispers from the LAO that could be well over 5%. And we know that if we end up with a 5% COLA, for next year. That will probably throw us out of, barring a major increase in our property taxes, that will potentially throw us out of basic aid status in the third year of our multi-year projection. So that's something we need to be thinking of. And then we've been hearing that the governor has lots of new dollars available. And so what is the governor going to do with those new funds? Is he putting those funds towards special education? Is he putting it towards special education in terms of, or PERS or STIRS? And is it going towards the Prop 98 or non-Prop 98? Because that's important. If it's within Prop 98, you'll continue to get that every year. If it's outside, it's one time. So it would be a one-time solution and not solve those PERS and STIRS increase issues. And then we have other things that we were discussing in terms of other impacts on our budgets based upon going into the community aid funded status. So I know that I've done a lot of talking, but I do wanted to turn this first over to Marcy and to Board President Shelley Hamilton.
Yeah, I just, before we jump into your presentation and kind of dive down on some of these questions, I just wanted to see if there was questions for clarification or if there was any large kind of consideration areas. You've certainly covered multiple pages, I can tell, and I also just want to say, Chris, reiterate what Marcy said in the very beginning of this meeting. Like, switching from one whole funding structure A to funding structure B in 2 weeks.
It's crazy.
And being able to digest it, understand it, pull together the pieces, and then come up with like all of these considerations. I just wanted to say thank you and acknowledge again the amount of work and effort that this has taken. Yep. So again, reiterating that all of this in 2 weeks and knowing that there's lots of, all of these outstanding considerations are still there, but oh my goodness. So I just first wanted to acknowledge that. I don't know. So, but then I also wanted to see if there were any trustees that had any kind of large issue areas that were not brought up in that list. I heard, considerations about these two funding structures and how they're calculated. There's a lot of questions in there around charter funding and in lieu and how that's calculated. Then there was a number of issues brought up in terms of the cash flow and switching to the mechanism by which who funds what and when. So there's that series of understandings in terms of switching to this whole new cadence and flow and who funds what when. Mm-hmm. Were there any other big areas of consideration or questions for clarification?
I have a question in regard to optics of what this has done. I know that you're talking math and numbers. I'm assuming Kate's here to explain why math and numbers work, but
let's hold that for the discussion part of it, because that's not a clarification question.
Fair
so
enough.
We can definitely get into that when we bring it back to the board for discussion.
Perfect. Thank you.
So this is just really if there's any other, and we will definitely go into some more questions as well. But before we move into, is there anything else?
I don't think at this time, no, I don't.
Yeah.
Okay. It's pretty comprehensive,
so. All right, then we can thank you, Kate, for being here and working with us on this. So we'd love to, now that you've heard all of this and some of the questions, but and that there are a lot.
There are a lot, and so I would like to start by reiterating what you said. What a joy it is to work with Chris Wilson.
Yes.
I think that you are exceedingly lucky here in Ross Valley. Chris is one of the finest CBOs I've worked with, so always ask the smartest questions in the room.
On that note, I just want to stand.
Good job, brother. I'm in the
You know that. Thank you.
We are so lucky to have you here.
You know that, Kate.
every
No,
day.
Seriously, you're
Yeah, so
very, very
thankful.
lucky. So CBOs are very thin on the ground these days, and you have one of the best that I've ever worked with.
That's
So,
great.
Couldn't agree more.
seriously, you're in very, very good hands here. And Chris has indeed done a massive amount of work in the last 2 weeks. So he has 20 years under his belt of being a CBO and truly understanding school district finance in a state-funded district. So he is having to come up to speed really, really quickly, and he's asking fantastic questions. And I have no doubt that he will be able to guide you through this really, really well. So I just want to really confirm you're in great hands. So let's see, one of these, who do I want to point it out? Where's that? Oh, that moved along. So I'd actually prepared a fairly dense presentation. I took it from a presentation that I made at a county office statewide conference on this whole issue of, and I refer to it as living on the cusp. You're state funded one year, you're basic aid the next year, and you can flip backwards and forwards. And it's a very, very complicated calculation. So I'd taken that presentation, I thought, I'll just amend that for Ross Valley. And then I thought, oh my goodness, okay, Kate, you were presenting this to business officials across the state, and they already have a fairly decent understanding. So how about we break this down into smaller bites? And so please know that I am more than willing and able to come back to your board. So you just let me know if you want to dive into this further. But I am going to try and take kind of a high-level view on this today as kind of a first tranche of this, right? And then as it sort of starts to seep in, if you're anything like me, it takes me a minute to digest and maybe sleep on it. And it's like, oh yeah, well, what about this, this, and this? And so, please feel free to be funneling those questions, and if it would be helpful to have us come back, more than willing to do that. So just at the high level then, your LCFF entitlement is driven by your attendance, which is a factor of how many kids are enrolled in the district. It's also driven by your, and I hate this term more than any other in the Ed Code, unduplicated pupil. Low income English learners, foster youth children, the number of those in proportion to your student body as a whole. What is the state funded COLA in any given year? And what about the state proration or deficit factor? Because it was only, was that a year ago that we were looking at a 10% up to the LCFF, right? So I went back to my 2021 budget adoption calculators. No, that was one that you cobbled together because they didn't have anything from FICMAT to help you out with that. So that's what you are entitled to. And that's the first step of the process, is to determine what are you entitled to. And the LCFF is a beautifully simple formula in comparison to what went before it, in that there is a rate per ADA. There's a different rate for K3 versus grades 4 through 6 versus grades 7 through 8 versus grades 9 through 12. But it's the same rate for every district and every charter school in the state. Where your LCFF entitlement differs is by the unduplicated pupil. Your proportion of low-income English learner and foster youth students will drive this additional piece of your LCFF, which is a supplemental grant. And if you have over 55% of your student body of those more vulnerable students, then you'll also get concentration grant funding. In the Ross Valley School District, you get supplemental grant funding as a part of your LCFF. So we start out by calculating what are you entitled to. And then we determine, well, who's paying for it? We always start with property taxes. But the state is on the hook for a minimum amount of funding to each and every district, because when they created the LCFF, the local control funding formula, back in 13, 14, somewhere back there, it was the end of the Great Recession, what they've taken, these 40 different categorical programs, these were all programs that they had cut by 20% during the Great Recession. And they had made those programs, when they cut them 20%, then they said, well, you get some flexibility with those dollars. You can spend them however you want. So they had been somewhat unrestricted then for a number of years when the LCFF came into place. So they rolled all of those dollars into the formula and said, rather than having a structure of revenue limit and categoricals, and I refer to categoricals, you can buy blue widgets, pink widgets, green widgets, right? Sacramento tells you what color widgets you can have this year. So no, we're just going to expand out basically revenue limits, right? Your base funding, your general purpose funding, by rolling all of those dollars into it. And then they had to make a promise that you would receive no less state aid going forward than you had in 12-13. So that for community funded districts, they would continue to receive those dollars, because without that guarantee, then every community funded district in the state would have lost a significant sum of money overnight, and that just would not have been palatable. So for you, your minimum state aid, the categorical funding that was rolled into your local control, is about $1.6 million. So the reason that you'll see on some of Chris's graphs that, well, wait a minute, property taxes aren't above your LCFF entitlement, so how are we basic aid? You take your total LCFF entitlement and you back off that $1.6 million that the state has got to pay you in state aid to see, well, how much has to be covered by property taxes? And if the property taxes exceed, then that means that you are basic aid. And that means everybody also gets education protection account funding, Act funding. And this funding came into play, if you recall, we were going to just about get another cut to schools, and then EPA went into effect to save us from another sudden death. But in order to get support from districts all over the state, then they had to ensure that a community-funded district would also receive some EPA funding. And so they added to the law that you would receive, no district would receive less than $200 per ADA in EPA funding.
Kate, was that the Prop 30?
Yes. So, you've seen this graphic, right? It's one that we all like to use because it shows it so clearly that, okay, you start out with what's your entitlement, you start to fill it up with the property taxes, and if it's not enough, then you have to have three taxes, right? Where does the state get its money from? Right? State aid to fill that pot up, to get you up to your entitlement.
Is it okay for us to ask quick clarification?
Absolutely.
So the quick clarification, in the cup that's pouring the property taxes, that actually includes property taxes plus what you were just talking about, which is the other state aid and the EPA?
Yes, no. What I'm going to say is the easiest way for me to explain it is that let's take your LCFF entitlement. It's running about $17 million, right? Back off $1.6 million because the state have to pay you that in state aid. So that brings you down.
So you're shrinking the cup instead of pouring more.
Yeah, so first of all, reduce your cup to what has to be covered by property taxes.
Got it.
Right, so if your property taxes are insufficient, then the state funding comes in to top you up and bring you up just to your entitlement level. And so your funding then is capped, so to speak, at your entitlement. But if you're basic aid, then the property taxes hit your entitlement level and keep on going, which means they overflow and you get to keep those excess taxes. You still get your state funding, right? So you're gonna get your $1.6 million. There, in the Constitution, it indicates that no district shall receive less than $120 per ADA in basic aid. And that's why we call community-funded districts basic aid districts, because of that basic aid provision in the Constitution. When the local control funding formula came into play, the state determined that the categorical funding within the LCFF, that minimum state aid they have to pay you, should satisfy your basic aid entitlement. Fun fact for you, San Rafael High School gets absolutely zero minimum state aid out of the LCFF. It's another long story, fair share reduction. When we all took hits, 20% reduction in state-funded schools, they couldn't take it away from basic aids because they weren't giving them any money. So instead, they said, well, we're going to give you a fair share reduction. We're going to take more of your categoricals away. For San Rafael High, that wiped out their categoricals completely. So they get nothing. But you also get this education protection account money because no district shall receive anything less than $200 per ADA. Well, if the only state aid you're getting is for that minimum state aid for your categoricals, those two pallets of dollars do not supplant one another. So you must have both your minimum state aid for categoricals and your EPA. EPA can't pay for the minimum state aid can't pay for the EPA. So as a community funded district, you can look at your revenues as being, okay, well, I'm gonna get my minimum state aid, I'm gonna get $200 per ADA for EPA, which is about $330,000 for you all, and my property taxes, and that will be my LCFF revenue if I add those three together.
Quick other question, clarification. When this was created, did it contemplate the in lieu? Because I notice it's not ever mentioned on this kind of.
Property taxes are a beast in themselves, and so we're going to talk about property taxes and the different elements of property taxes. And so, we're used to in state-funded districts, if we just look at what's my net property taxes, I just look at the bottom line. I don't care about the moving parts in between. See that most of it comes in from secured taxes, but there's these other little pieces, and some of them are bigger than other, and ERAF is a complete Rube Goldberg, and so, okay, that's how much I'm getting, and it really, well, for example, at budget adoption, so we ask all of the districts to provide us your data elements. What do you think your enrollment will be? What do you think your unduplicated pupil count will be? What do you think your property tax growth rate will be? Well, for Chris, in a state-funded district, he doesn't care. Our property tax growth, it doesn't matter. And so at budget adoption, that was entered as a 0%. Well, I've since had some very good conversations with my staff about there is never 0% property tax growth. So we will always look at property tax growth. Do not ever make the assumption that a district is state-funded or not state-funded. You must go through all of these details. Every single one of those details matters. So, property taxes.
That wasn't wet.
That's why you're president, Shelley.
So, property taxes and ERAF, and truly ERAF is a Rube Goldberg machine. So, ERAF was created when the state was in trouble, and it was created by taking money away from local taxing entities, the cities and counties, and essentially creating another tax pot, right? It's as if, the county says, okay, well, Ross Valley gets this much, and the mosquito abatement gets this much, and the city gets this much, and the county gets this much, right? So they created an ERAF, and ERAF gets X amount. And in the ERAF pot, there's secured taxes, unsecured taxes, homeowner exemption taxes, unitary taxes, all of the different type of taxes go into the ERAF pot. So it's almost as if they created this entity called ERAF. I do not know why it's called the Education Revenue Augmentation Fund, because it does not augment revenues for school districts. And our cities and counties think that school districts have stolen the money from them. No, it was the state. So the state took the money, and because they were broke, and it made life easier for them. And the way that ERAF works is if you're a state-funded district, And you end up with more property taxes, that's less state aid they have to give you. If you end up with less property taxes, that's more state aid. So it just balances, right? So it's back to that filling up the beaker, right? So if you're state funded, it doesn't matter. So therefore, ERAF can never be allocated to basic aid districts. And you cannot allocate ERAF to make a district go basic aid. It's happened in the state because so few people understand ERAF, they don't know how it works, and so it's been one county millions of dollars that I may have to go back and reverse. So, as a non-basic aid district, so what ERAF, so you have X amount of money in the ERAF pot. First of all, ERAF has to fund school districts to say, okay, which school districts need money to get them up to their full entitlement. How much is that need? And we call that your ERAF capacity. Is there any money left in the ERAF pot after we've done that? In 5 counties in the state, there's still money left. So the next draw on that money is for the SELPA.
Yeah.
So the SELPA in Marin County is 100% funded with property taxes. 55% of the county offices' property taxes go off to the SELPA, and the remaining need for the SELPA, because it's a very similar formula to local control, what's the entitlement, how much property tax do you have, state aid fills up the difference. In our county, ERAF fills up the difference. It's about $13 million. And you say, okay, we're going to pay the SELPA out of that. Whatever is left is then called excess ERAF, and that is paid back out to the counties and cities from whom it was originally taken. And then we get to the next part of this Rube Goldberg, and this is the vehicle license fee. So vehicle license fee used to be paid by the state, they put it on the locals, so now the vehicle license fee has to be paid out of what is left in the ERAF. Well, what's left in there, the way that the calculation works, I've paid out the excess, I've paid out the SELPA, so essentially the amount of money that I'm going to pay out to the districts to get them up to the full amount is what I have left to play with. Not enough money here. It's $30 million ERAF capacity, it's a $60 million VLF license fee, so that means that, then that makes that negative $30 million that we need to pull back from the districts so that the locals can pay the VLF fee, and then the districts will get backfilled with state aid. That is a horribly complicated calculation. Piece that Chris was talking about, the lawsuit between CSBA and Betty Yee, is all about the amount of excess ERAF that is paid back out to your counties and cities. Mm-hmm. The CSBA is, in their opinion, excess ERAF is too high. We're retaining too much locally, is getting paid out to the cities and counties. And the reason they say it's too high is because when you're counting how much money do you need to bring everybody whole, you should be counting charter schools as well. And we do, but they don't understand that we do. So that's, they'll figure it out in court, and I'd love to see a judge work his way through an ERAF calculation, because that would be fun to watch, because
I'd love
it's...
to hear how that is funded, how you do that calculation for charter schools.
So we're going to talk about the in lieu a little bit, because that will help us understand. So essentially, the in lieu tax, how much do you pay in lieu tax? The maximum you pay is their base grant LCFF. You don't pay for the supplemental, and if they were high concentration, that has to be paid with state aid. So you're either going to pay them their LCFF base grant. If you're basic aid, that's what you'll be paying, because the alternative is you're paying them property taxes per ADA, which is what you pay if you were state funded. In this particular situation, you're only going to pay when you're basic aid, so we'll talk about that a little bit more. So where the CSBA, I honestly don't know where they got lost in the calculation.
Well, so my question, I guess, is more, not so much the calculation, but who's entitled to receive the ERAF funds.
Uh-huh. Right. Well, charter schools are not taxing entities. They don't receive property taxes. And so that's the stance of the Auditor Tax Controller, is that charter schools do not receive property taxes directly. ERAF is a property tax. Therefore, charter schools receive in lieu tax payments. So we are calculating, the 5 excess counties are indeed calculating property taxes based upon net of in lieu, taking it at the full LCFF.
So you are counting charters
Yeah.
in figuring out the LCFF? And then, just for my clarification, the ERAF is a bucket that is taxes, but it's been separated, it's been city collected or other entities' taxes that have been brought back.
Originally, it was
Right,
pulled out of all of the
pulled
other
out of
entities.
other
Yes.
entities' taxes. And then it's calculated on an ADA basis rather than,
No, the
No.
ERAF collections are just based upon tax collections. And so
but when you're paying out to a district or to a
it's
charter
based
school,
upon how much do they need to get to their full entitlement, and back off by $1 because you cannot make a district basic aid with ERAF.
But you brought him right down to the brink.
Yeah, you get all the way up to within $1.
So basically the backfilling is through a combination of ERAF and state aid.
Yeah, so
If
there are
needed.
counties where the ERAF is insufficient to fully fund all districts, and you get positive ERAF. It doesn't ever get to negative ERAF, you get positive ERAF dollars. It's different county by county. In Marin County, in common with Napa, San Mateo, Santa Clara, and San Francisco, we are called excess ERAF counties. There is sufficient ERAF in the pot to pay all the school districts, pay the SELPA, and there's still money left over. So
and that
the
includes
argument,
charters,
the
right?
lawsuit is about excess ERAF and it's about charter schools.
Right, and whether they're school districts for purposes of ERAF, I think is the way they state it, but I guess that's the question to you. You're treating RVS, or what is it, Ross Valley Charter School as a school district and allocating ERAF?
Because we're not as a, that's one of the, because as a non-basic aid, we haven't been paying any in lieu. So somewhere the in lieu has been being paid for the students in our district. Is that coming through the ERAF?
No.
Oh.
No, that's a total confusion. So, I'm not quite sure how to get us past ERAF. So,
Which is more basically, we haven't been paying it. Somebody's been paying it. Now we're gonna be paying it,
because
so
they are a
who's
state
not?
authorized charter school, you will start paying them the year after you certify basic aid. So far, there are about 5 districts within the county who have students at Ross Valley Charter, so Lagunitas, Bolinas Shoreline, Kentfield.
How are they getting paid though now for the students in our district?
From the state.
From the
State is
state.
funding them,
Not through the
100%.
Okay, the state.
State is funding them 100%.
Okay.
The basic
So what
aid is-
about 47635 then, with that doesn't call for state funding? I guess I'm just confused about how the state is directly funding the charter school when
It's
there's an in lieu property
specifically
tax.
because they are a state board of education authorized charter school.
Yes, understood, but that change in law was only 2 years ago.
Correct.
Right. So I'm just curious how that happened before,
How was Ross Valley funded before
with
the
the in
change
lieu
in law?
property tax, right? Before the law changed.
Good question.
You weren't paying any in lieu. You've never paid any
No, we
in lieu.
never, no.
State board authorized charters have been funded by the state.
Although we may have, because
I think you
There's-
have.
there was something
think
that I
so.
saw, a note from Midge, we might have some move in lieu
We're-
It could be
we're
that you
holding
were
on.
paying in lieu until they changed the
Oversight?
law, right? So which happened at the same time as the renewal, and of course Marin County gets to be the first in the state to be assigned to a state board authorized, right? So this was the renewal of this charter school. And it was the first renewal, I think, with this particular law.
Yeah, it's the first time it
in place.
was a state board
Yeah.
approved charter.
And we should definitely look into this because I do remember in your big, huge, in the budget thing back in 2016, 17, there wasn't, and I was looking at the in lieu and the new one, but there was one other one way back then that was somehow on there
Yeah.
that I looked at it when I was flipping through all the detailed stuff. So that I think we could put a pin in
I
trying to
can certainly
look
look into it. I mean, normally a district authorized charter, the district pays the full in lieu for all students in attendance. And if you have students attending the charter that come from state-funded districts, then you can apply for charter supplemental funding. Because the state figures they would have been paying for those kiddos anyway. But this is a different situation because it's State Board of Education authorized. But, the charter's been through one renewal. I anticipate that they'll come around to another renewal. And so that's another piece for you to just understand the difference in funding between a district authorized charter and a State Board of Education authorized charter. So, to take us back to ERAF, in our county, the ERAF ends up going negative, and it's about $30 million that is collected from essentially 3 school districts. Well, the number has been ever changing. So there are Ross Valley, San Rafael Elementary, Nevada Unified. But last year, there was also Miller Creek and Larkspur.
Yeah.
And 2 years before that, there was also Mill Valley and Kentfield. So we have had 4 districts now who have been going through this process of coming through the cusp. Well, every time you change what your ERAF capacity is, then that ends up changing what the reverse ERAF collection is from you. And it also then changes, well, depending upon how many districts are within that pot, what is your share of that pot? And so as we can see for Ross Valley, it's a pretty large chunk of change, almost $5 million that is withdrawn from your calculation. And so on the natural, I'm starting to think about San Rafael Elementary and Novato for next year. That means that's another $5 million negative that they're going to be absorbing, right? That they'll get backfilled with state aid. But again, that becomes a cash flow issue, especially because of the timing of CDE's certifications. So you don't get a certification. The certifications drive how CDE is paying you. So we always want to know at P2 where we are, which is April 15th, because if you change as of June 30th, it won't get picked up by the state until February of the following year. And that can have a material impact on your cash flow. So if we take $5 million out of your property taxes, right? At budget adoption, it was assumed, that's going to stay the same. I don't attempt to figure out, well, will it be 4.8? Will it be 4.7? Because what I can guarantee you is it will be perfectly wrong, no matter which number I land on, right? So it was assumed that that was going to stay flat and would stay in there. When you dive into the details, it's like, should have pulled that out. So the amount of ERAF that you're going to be charged will depend upon the number of districts in the county that are subject to ERAF, and that number has been changing each and every year. And that is, in a nutshell, why a budget adoption, the assumption was you would continue to be state funded, and why now doing a further drilling down and looking at the individual pieces of your property taxes is pretty darn clear that you become basic aid. And there's 300 ADA is the drop in ADA that you're going to recognize in 22-23. That is a lot of ADA out of 1,900. It is a significant percentage of your ADA has dropped out. And in all the times that we've been doing these cusp calculations for districts, I've never seen anything like that kind of swing. That kind of swing absolutely pushes you into community funded status. And the in lieu, and we did confirm this with CDE, because we had a question as well, wait a minute, but that charter went to Ross Valley, were denied by Ross Valley, were denied by the county, were then authorized by the state. So is the district in fact going to be on the hook? We need to know. We know that other basic aid districts within the county are, but is Ross Valley, is that treated separately because that is the location of the charter school? Does that have any impact on it? They were very clear in coming back to us and saying, if they flip basic aid, they are responsible for in lieu in the year subsequent to certifying basic aid.
A question. Maybe this may be the time. Why would anybody then, in the future or currently, approve any charter schools, or if they know if you're basic aid and the charter school comes to us and says, oh yeah, we want to be, why would any board approve them knowing they're going to give all of the in lieu payments to a group of people that are not, there's no insane, and for renewals the same way. Why would anybody do that?
Very good question, Ryan. I happen to be a charter school supporter in that I come from a very small country that has a far more choice in educational paths than we have in America, and so I always thought charter schools are great. I like the idea. You shut them down if they're not doing a good job. What a great idea, because I know school districts that don't do a good job and they keep going. So however many years ago that was, it's a long time ago that the charter school movement happened in California, 94, right? Something like that. But from the gates, I've always said, wow, well, the state did that really well, didn't they? They got some great public school reform out of charter schools, and they didn't have to pay a penny for it. It was all born off the backs of locals. And it's created, right from the very get-go, a tension and a conflict between districts and charter schools. Why would a district ever want to authorize a charter? It automatically means less funding. And while certainly maybe you would have fewer students to serve, what we know is that you can't cut your costs as rapidly as you lose the revenue. So whether you are a basic aid district or whether you are state funded, there's no incentive from a financial point of view to approve a charter school. But that's why the law has always had all of these pieces about you aren't allowed to look at it from a financial point of view. Again, how ridiculous if it's going to make a district go broke. So I think it's a huge tension in this state. I don't think they've ever resolved it, and it will continue to be a tension.
Were you saying that a board cannot deny them based on financial impacts that a charter school would have on it?
I'm not up to speed on the latest and greatest in charter school approval laws. So
The same time there was the change in 2019, there was change. So for new charters that would come as opposed to renewal charters, you can consider the fiscal impact on the district as well as the community impact, your educational programs and things like that. Was that
Should we, let's finish this, because then we
going.
gotta go to public comment, and then we'll bring it back to the board and we'll continue on with these. No, I mean, I think clarification questions, just kind of that is a good, and it indicates,
So in lieu transfer, driven by student attendance, and as I've explained, you're either paying the LCFF base grant per ADA or you're paying property taxes per ADA, whichever is the lower. So if you authorize the charter school, you're responsible for paying the in lieu for every student in attendance there. Whether you're state funded or basic aid, it doesn't matter, you're responsible.
And including students who come from other districts.
Yep.
Your property taxes are still paying for those students. Okay,
Yes,
just
absolutely.
clarification. Okay.
Absolutely. which is why I think Willow Creek Academy was one of the most unique charter schools I've ever come across. It's in a deeply basic aid district, but of course they no longer exist, so they've moved on from that. But I always thought that was very, very interesting, very unique. So State Board of Education is this whole other ball game, and this collecting in lieu transfer from districts that certified basic aid in the prior year.
Yeah.
There's actually code in there for that to happen for district authorized charters, but they've never implemented that code, and they have no intention of implementing it. But they are absolutely implementing it for these State Board of Education authorized charters. And what we should all understand is that the state will flow funding out to the charter school based upon those in lieu calculations that they will make. They will make the assumption that those districts are making the payments on time according to Ed Code, because they will have reduced the cash that they're providing them accordingly. So we are pretty sure that you're going to flip to basic aid in 22-23, which means that you'll be responsible for in lieu of tax transfer payments for all district students, not all of the students, the district students, beginning in 23-24. And based on 123 ADA, the LCFF base grant is about $1 million.
Yes.
Could I ask a real quick question? I'm sorry. Related to that the last one, when you, so we flip in 22-23, and we're responsible for the in lieu in 23-24.
Correct.
What happens if we flip out in 23-24 back to state aid? Are we still responsible for the?
Still responsible for the in lieu payment in 23-24, but then you won't be responsible for one in 24-25.
Okay, so it's a cash flow issue, but it still nets to the.
So you'd pay them, but then you'd have nothing, and then the next year you wouldn't have to pay them, and you'd have money. Is that kind of how that goes?
Yes, except
And
that,
they want you to do that?
except the difference is in 23-24, if you flip back to state aid funded, at least then you're going back to receiving your apportionment on a monthly basis for whatever the state aid is.
And does the state then
To
fund
match it.
you so that you don't drop below the LCFF entitlement? So if you
Correct.
have to make those payments, but you're in state funded, then the state back. So either the state is backfilling the charter or paying the charters in lieu, or you're paying the charters in lieu and the state's backfilling you, or they're paying it, and it's, so there's not a scenario
Correct.
in which you go below the LCFF entitlement because
Correct.
you're having to make payments. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Never go below the LCFF entitlement. And in terms of making the payments for in lieu, the districts in the county have come to an agreement that, which you're perfectly able to do. So the Ed Code reads that you would make in lieu payments on a monthly basis to ensure that charter school has cash flow. The charter recognized that it was collecting in lieu tax payments from basic aid districts, and they came to an agreement with the districts that they would collect their in lieu basically in December and then in April and then the true up in June, so that it coincides with the district's cash flow and that they're not asking the districts to pay out that cash ahead of actually receiving it. And so that would be something then that you would then need to decide as to whether you would want to enter into that locally determined agreement or whether you want to go with Ed Code. But that's a decision for you to make down the road. Just to know that this absolutely is a cash flow issue, but there are lots of ways in which to mitigate those cash flow issues. And overarching it all is an excellent relationship with the County of Marin. That allows us to borrow money very, very cheaply. And indeed, I mean, we hit this with two districts on the cusp, and they were changing status between P2, April 15th, and June 30th, and it looked like, oh my goodness, they're going to take a bunch of negative ERAF from them on June 30th, and that's going to make the general fund negative cash. And the county very quickly came up with a solution and a way to extend a time, because normally a tax anticipation note has to be repaid by April 15th.
Yeah.
But the county will extend a cross-year loan. So they'll extend you the loan through July 1, and then they'll take the money back July 1 and you'll go back negative. So they'll just give you a loan on June 30th and then take it back on July 1st. But again, that is something that is unique to Marin. I'm not aware of any other county that works as closely or is as supportive of the school districts in their county.
Quick technical question on the agreement that you had mentioned. Is that between the charter and all the individual districts, or between the county office as the authorizer or is it a collective agreement?
No, it went into place it went into place as soon as that state law went into place. And I think that state law went into place a year before the renewal when the county office was assigned as the authorizer. So it's actually an agreement between the individual districts, the charter school, and the county office, because we have agreed to do the calculation for them using the locally driven data, right? So rather than waiting for CDE to publish and certify the data, which is how Enrollment is calculated at the state level, we provide them that data, and so we're calculating the Enrollment on the data that we provide them so that we can get real-time data. The concern amongst districts was that the way Enrollment flows, the first months of the year, meaning from July all the way through February, the cash flow is based upon whatever you received last year, whatever was certified at P2 in the prior year. And so our district is saying, well, wait a minute, you go K5. I could have a kid with you last year and they're not with you this year. I don't want to be giving you money if I don't have any kids there. And likewise, the charter didn't want to find themselves in the place of getting money that then they got to pay back. And so we said, okay, then charter school, you provide us with your P1 ADA. And it's a very rapid turnaround, but so we can have real-time data for the current year and nobody is paying out for a student that doesn't attend there.
How is that validated?
Well, it's then validated against the certification from CDE to make sure that we are not making any errors.
So you actually would know when they give you the P1 ADA exactly where those residents live?
No, we don't get into residency.
Right, so that's,
Charter school
that was my question.
provides the lists of students that are in attendance, and so let's say there's students that come from Bolinas, right? And
Yeah.
so they provide those lists. They actually provide them to us at the county office. We then provide them out to the districts on a secure website where each district just has access to their own student list. And then the districts work directly with the charter school on residency and any information they require for residency. And we've made it very clear, and it's clearly stated in this MOU, that the charter must abide by district residency requirements. So nothing to do with that. And whatever district resident requirements are, then provide them the information they're asking.
Can I ask a question? Have they ever provided us that information, the Ross Valley Charter School?
No.
No. Have we asked for that before?
Yes.
Yes. So therein lies my real question. If you don't have a level of trust where you're actually getting the information that you'd like to validate in order to make an in-lieu payment, how is it possible that a state approved charter school, not a district approved or not a county approved charter school, can then obfuscate getting the information, especially as it gets into this arena? Like before, if you just need your numbers and you need your things because of space and other things, I can understand, that, but now we're talking about taking dollars out of our wallet without validating who and where those people come from. And
The one shift
Totally
is that
understand the concern. And what I would say is that the districts that have been paying the in-lieu had exactly the same concerns.
Yep.
I want to make absolutely sure that they are not paying for students that are not their own. Last year there were 2 students that the parents had identified them as living in, I think it was Ross District, but in point of fact, they were really in the Larkspur District. I might have the districts mixed up, but there was absolutely a question about how those 2 students were identified. So CDE had them identified in District A, but it was agreed upon between the 2 districts first. Oh yeah, actually no, those are my kids. And then the charter then worked with CDE to actually process an adjustment so that they would get those kids properly identified.
that's considered that would be if people are working together. if it's an adversarial situation and you don't have trust and you at the MCOE are actually the oversight agent, would you be the one that got that information and then provided that to the district who's actually the money is coming from? Or are you asking our district to just open the wallet to someone says this is what we have?
Now, I'm not going to ask you to do either one of those. I'm going to tell you you've got two choices. The Ed Code says that you pay them based upon prior year data, or you can go with a locally agreed upon, a local agreement where you can make more sense to you.
But they never provided us the data, is what I'm trying to tell you.
One of the differences is that they do have an MOU now that says they have to follow the district's residency requirements, which wasn't in place before,
Right.
which is in place now,
Right.
where there has been an agreement. So for us to then say, here's our district verification requirements, that is different, which gives it more, you can go
Validity.
more, you can go back on
Yeah,
it.
and I would say that, this has not been a kumbaya relationship
Really?
between the other districts in the county. Is basic aid districts that have got nothing to do with Ross Valley Charter. It's not in their location. They didn't authorize it. They don't want them there. Why should they now be paying money? For Lagunitas School District, it is actually going to cause hardship for that district because there are quite a number of students have left from them. So it has not been kumbaya at all. The first year, I would say it took quite a while to get everybody to a point where the districts felt comfortable with the information that they had been provided. So, we don't actually transfer the dollars. We just do the calculations. And so then the district then cuts the check when they are at a point that they feel like they have the information they need in order to do that.
Is the MOU that you're talking about that has the district residency requirements, is that the MOU between the charter and the basic aid districts, or is that your oversight?
The county office
No,
MOU.
that is between the districts and the charter school. The county office also signs onto it because we agree that we'll prepare the calculation.
Was
But
there
you're the oversight.
separate from your
It
oversight?
is completely
MOU.
separate from our oversight. This was developed before we were assigned the oversight.
I'm gonna just process-wise, I'm gonna, because I know we're almost down to the end of the presentation, and I
Yes.
do want to make sure we get any public comment and then bring it back and kind of go through questions. I know that this part of it is probably one of the more juicy ones, shall we say? So I want to continue on in this conversation. But if we wouldn't mind, just because I know we need to do a public comment pause, and then we can feel more free to kind of get back into discussions and deeper questions. But I don't want to ignore any of the public that is here to see if there's anyone who wanted to ask any questions. All right, just want to make sure I'm following that procedure. Now we shall carry on with the wrap up of this, and then we'll go through with questions. Thank
So
you.
what this graph is designed to show you, and I realize I should get some different colors because green and blue are two very close to one another. But in the years 1819 through 21-22, the green and the blue are overlapping because they're one and the same. You were state funded. You received as much funding as you were entitled to, but not a penny more. Now you're starting to see from 21-22, you get to 22-23, and I've got this green line
Up here.
going on the bottom. That's your entitlement. That's what you're entitled to. And this is on a per ADA basis. And then the blue line, what you'll actually have in funding. And so what it shows is this big jump up in 22-23.
Yeah.
It's about $1.8 million in total in excess taxes. And I would caution you to treat that first year of flipping into basic aid, treat it as one-time money, because there are too many uncertainties about what happens going forward from there. So this graph says that property taxes are going to increase at 3%, COLA is going to be 2.5%, and then somewhere around 3%. So COLA and property taxes are very close. Maybe property taxes is just very slightly above COLA. And so you get hit with in lieu taxes in 23-24, which is why you come back down again.
Yep.
But you're still right above, right? So it looks like you stay basic aid. So just because I'm a data freak, and I just thought, well, why don't you complicate it, Kate? I went ahead and ran the same calculation, and I changed one factor. I said, okay, the Legislative Analyst's Office has just provided their November fiscal outlook, and they said COLA's going to be 5.35% in 22-23. And we've been watching the revenue reports coming in each and every month, and each and every month the revenue is outpacing the budget. So I will be shocked if it's under 5%. So LAO's prediction is good enough for me. It's published data. So I said, okay, let's go ahead and just change the COLA. Don't change anything else in this calculation. I changed the COLA to 5.35% for 23-24. Then, when I apply the in lieu, oh, well, now you're state funded. And so then I start to see this peak up and go back down, and then peak up and go back down.
Exactly.
And you flip in and out each and every year. So the reason you end up flipping in and out is you apply the in lieu the first year after becoming basic aid.
Yeah.
But you lose your supplemental taxes the first year after becoming basic aid. So now that's 2 hits, right?
But if I could ask one other thing. We have assumed a property tax increase now at 3% per year.
Yep.
Which is a conservative number.
Yeah, very
What has been
conservative.
Very much.
Is it a 7 or 6 year average? Do you remember the exact figure?
I thought it was somewhere above 5.5. Yeah.
So it was quite a bit higher, and the current year is around 3.9.
But the
So-
current year is depressed by about 1%. And the
Yeah.
reason it's depressed in the current year, so any of you that pay property tax bills, you know that your property taxes go up. There's an annual inflation, right? So Prop 13 put in a limit to what that annual inflation is going to be. So property taxes will inflate every year by the lesser of California CPI, Consumer Price Index, or 2%. So for 21-22, California CPI is 1.01 or something, right? It's just over 1%, which means that we're limited, the assessor was limited to just putting a 1% inflation on property taxes this year. And so what we've seen countywide, Bolinas is the exception. There's something weird going on in Bolinas, but otherwise, countywide, every single district, their property tax growth rate is about 1 percentage point lower than we have seen on average. So if you're at 4.5 or 5 this year, then I would expect it to go up a percentage next year. So we will definitely be spending a lot of time. So here are your variables. What is property tax growth rate versus COLA?
Yeah.
In general, the property tax growth rate in Marin County has outpaced state COLA. This year and next year are total anomalies in the state budget. Chris and I have been in this business for a long time, and neither one of us have ever seen COLAs like this, and certainly not 2 years in a row. It is unprecedented. And then, of course, ADA. So the projection is that the Bay Area counties are going to lose a lot of enrollment. The state in general is declining enrollment, and the projection for Marin County is we will lose 14.92% of our enrollment over the course of the next decade. So we can expect then, enrollment in general is going to be on a downward trend. So if your ADA is going down, your entitlement is going down, while your taxes are continuing to go up, you are more likely to stay in basic aid. If your enrollment starts to pick up, then the reverse is true.
So the other variable, back to our subject we were talking about just a moment ago, not just our ADA, but also the charters in lieu and the charters ADA. So in terms of that being one of the knobs on the budget that you're projecting out into the future, are we now in the position of projecting the charters enrollment? Because it directly impacts our budget, right? So how do we do that?
You will be
Because if we're
paying-
narrow, it could bump us in and out.
I would say if you were having to pay in lieu on all of their kids, then that's an impossibility theorem. But your remit is to pay in lieu for district enrolled students. So if we take the district as a whole, and what do we project our enrollment to be? I think that can get us close, and I'll tell you, I mean, Chris was within, it was less than an ADA of what their actual P1 ADA is. So,
But that's the ADA this year, not projected out for 22, 23, and 23, 24. So if we're using this year's ADA, are we just assuming it? I mean, that's the question, is it assumed flat? Is it assumed increasing? Because I know they had assumed an increase in enrollment, and how
charter schools always assume an increase in enrollment.
Yeah.
I've never met a charter that hasn't. and I've rarely met one that actually managed to make that increase in enrollment. So I think that they've now been around for what, 6 years, 7 years?
Something like that, yes.
And their ADA has stayed very much the same that entire time, right? It really hasn't changed dramatically that I'm aware of. So I would not assume big changes in the Ross Valley Charter Schools enrollment. I would certainly be asking them for multi-year projections.
Yeah.
And and again, you know, in our oversight capacity, we will be doing the same thing. And we can certainly share that data with you as we share data within the county. I think that is probably one of the most stable pieces of all of the variables that you have going on
when you
here.
think
The
about it.
charter ADA is actually the least of my concerns.
Well, that's Hartwood closed, right? And they got a big bump. So things like that, what I think.
there have been events that precipitate big chunks of unexpected
Swings.
swings.
And then COVID, and then so
And in-district versus out-of-district, if the district's only responsible for
right.
Yeah.
your own students.
It's really about you are responsible for your own students. If you had to try and figure out, oh gosh, what this will be based on, who knows, right? I mean, they did pick up enrollment this last year from school districts that weren't open. And, you know, in my opinion, once a kid has moved, you might as well say goodbye to them because they likely won't come back again, right?
So does MCOE validate or do its own check on their multi-year projections to say, that's a little too much, or okay, that's good?
We hire Figma to do that.
Figma does.
So we felt that this was such a unique situation we had been put into with the Ross Valley Charter, and this being the first time that a charter had been assigned to somebody in the state. We just said, we'll call in the experts. And so Michelle Giacomini, deputy at Figma, actually leads the work with Ross Valley Charter and does their financial reviews. So I'd say going forward, what do you need to do to manage this? This is most difficult from a cash flow perspective. It's most difficult from a budgeting perspective. As I said, making just that one change to the factors gave you $1.8 million excess every other year, right? So, one-time money of $1.8 million every other year is not very useful. I've spent my career taking these and turning them into a straight line, right? Our job in the business office is to smooth things out as much as we possibly can. So one of the ways that you handle it is through having decent reserves. And basic aid districts, generally speaking, tend to need higher reserves because things can happen to property taxes. I can remember working auditing San Mateo Union High School at the time of 9/11. Well, the airport got shut down and every business that was paying property taxes by being in location at the airport put in for a rebate, and the amount of money that got paid back out, right? So within that same current year, you now had to rebate because they all got reassessed. And that had to come from the district. If they didn't have reserves, they would have been dead overnight. So Most basic aid districts follow Government Finance Officers strategies, Government Finance Officers Association recommendation, which is a 17% reserve. It's essentially 2 months of operating expenditures. I would strongly recommend we do an annual property tax forum. We host that at the county office. We invite the county auditor and tax collector, the county assessor, and then a local economist, John Haveman, to present at the property tax forum. And it's open to, we'd like to have board trustees there because we think this is of great importance to most districts within the county. And it starts to help us understand what is the data that you're looking at, and what does it mean, and where do we go with that?
Along those lines, I know this is a big topic, and just managing all of the time in this, and I want to make sure that we kind of go down the line. We might not be able to have all of our questions answered, but I want to make sure, because what we will do is collect all of the questions that remain outstanding that we don't have answers to, get them all down in writing in addition to some of the ones that we've already heard, and get those to you as well. So as you mentioned, we can have you either back, we can follow up in writing, all of the above, given that this is a 2 weeks old, 2 weeks new discussion, and there's all these variables.
Huge change for the district. I mean, I would focus on the fact that it means that you've been discussing the fiscal cliff, right? And that you're going to be losing millions of dollars in revenue. So all indications are you just got another year, right?
That's what it is.
It just pushed it back, but
one more year. I wouldn't see it as anything more than that. It's bought you a year. And a year that's nice, right? So we take it wherever we can get it in this industry. I would not go beyond that though.
So I want to start, Wesley, if you.
Is this the end of the slide presentation?
Oh, yeah, this is.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, indeed.
I was looking, I flipped ahead and saw the question mark hands.
Okay.
Do we want to start down here and I want to make sure we hear everyone's questions.
Sure.
Okay.
Kate, in the past 3 or 4 years, how many districts here in Marin have moved from basic aid back down to the LCFF and then back up to basic aid and done the drift?
In the last few years, they've all been moving from state funded into LCFF. But when I first got here, which was the year before LCFF, so once LCFF was introduced, the LCFF grew school funding so rapidly that there were a number of districts that were basic aid during the recession because our funding, the entitlement, was so low, it had been cut by 20%.
Wesley, do you mean just like?
Just the past 3 or 4 years.
Oh.
Yeah, not the whole historical bit, you know.
So it's, you've got Miller Creek, Larkspur, Kentfield, Mill Valley. Those 4 districts have all been doing the interstate funded and then back out and into basic aid. And some of them have gone in and out, in and out, in and out.
Ugh. That's all I got for you right now.
And trustees, again, if other questions come, please send them in to Marcy, and she will be our collector of questions. So.
Yeah, so I'm quite familiar with a different model. The worry I have is the in and out.
Yeah.
Because this is not something that I'm so familiar with, and this is something that I think we need to support Chris in making sure that at the time of doing the cash flow and the budget should we be more should be careful about that famous one-time money we're going to get with this supplemental tax next year, and how the calculation of that I'm interested, but I think it's getting too technical for this evening. The thing I wanted you to comment on is something that we talk a lot about, is how you are deep when you are deep in community funded versus non-deep. Can you explain a little bit that concept so that we're all on the same page regarding how deep we are and what does that mean?
So glad you brought that up, Maddie, because I think that one of the issues with being identified as being basic aid is that there is an immediate thought that, oh, great, that means we're rich, we've got money. Well, there's a world of difference between a Ross school district basic aid, or a Bolinas actually is the most deeply basic aid of our districts, a Bolinas school district, and a Miller Creek, or indeed a Ross Valley. So you are really still, by looking at that last graph, you can see how close you were, right? You get 1 year of bump up, and otherwise you... Basic aid, yes, but what does it mean? It really doesn't mean a heck of a lot. It's not a lot of money. Well, Marie, it's a little bit like the difference between San Rafael High and Tamalpais, right? So San Rafael High 2 years ago closed out with $17 per ADA in excess taxes.
Oh yeah, we spend it well.
So I hope you're careful about where you spend that money, right? Versus Tamalpais, $3,000 per ADA in excess taxes, right? So there's an idea of the exponential difference. And so, yes, you're turning basic aid, but your funding is still very, very similar to a state-funded district.
We don't become rich by doing by just turning. I just wanted to make sure we all hear that.
That's the message.
We all hear that, and we are clear about that. This extra money that we can keep is the more money you keep, the deeper you are. But if you can't keep a lot, you're not that deep. So we're not getting much extra money here.
Correct.
That's my understanding. Thank you very much.
Unless there's no payments.
Yep.
There's nothing. Okay. Given the complexities and this conception out in most of the community, because we're on the, we sit here and dive into all of these. Most people out in the community have very little understanding of this, shall we say. And they think basic aid, lots of money. They think, oh, Ross Valley School District is going to basic aid. It must mean that they're flush with cash. Has the County Office of Education worked with any of these other districts to help with community communications, forums, whatever it might be, to help the community out there understand this, what we just talked about?
We haven't done any community forums, but certainly we have gone to a lot of board meetings to have exactly these kind of discussions. And I am very clear always. Basic aid doesn't mean you're rich. It's a formula calculation, but it doesn't actually mean that you are rich. I think it's the hardest thing of this calculation because there is, that's an entrenched, it's a belief, right? And those are difficult to shift.
Okay. Keep moving.
I just kind of had a general question. It seems like this is a very complex situation we're in, we're finding ourselves in. We're going between one very different set of criteria for funding our district rather than another. It seems like this was very sudden. Chris had to throw this together with less than 2 weeks. So my question is when is it normal that we would find this information out? Because we approved a budget back in June. And I'm a new member, and so I'm not really familiar with how this all goes. But it seems like we would need more time to prepare these things and go over them and calculate these things and find out about attendance and project things more accurately. What's the normal timeline on these things?
I think that we followed all of the normal timelines, but what we've discovered here is an error, right, in the budget adoption calculation. So when it got discovered, then everybody went to work. So it was discovered when I was reviewing the first interim calculators. And I said, wait a minute, what are you doing here? What's going on? You haven't looked at this closely enough. And pulled my team together again to look at that again. So, but I'll also say that, this is one of the few counties in the state that actually provides those calculations out to their districts. Have you ever had a county give you your LCF before, Chris?
I have had one, but not one.
Right, so it's one of those situations, we actually stopped doing the multi-year projections on the calculators a couple of years ago.
You were doing them?
And the reason I stopped doing them is because I started hearing districts say, oh, well, Kate said my property tax growth rate is this. And I, whoa, wait a minute. No, that's not my budget. You own that budget. We're giving you some numbers as a second set of eyes so that you can compare these numbers to your numbers and you can determine that they're reasonable, but you have to own them at the end of the day.
Yep.
And so I said, okay, I'm not doing multi-years anymore. I'm not going to be responsible for people's out-year property tax growth rates. You have to make those decisions yourself. I will always do a calculation because my work in determining whether your budget is reasonable, a number doesn't mean anything until you compare it to another number. And so I always prepare my expectation of where you're going. And then I can look at your numbers and then that gives me an immediate sense of, okay, what? So how did we not discover it sooner? Because Chris has been in state-funded districts for 20 years. He never had to look at the ins and outs of individual property taxes because ERAF is an ever-changing number based upon the number of districts that are subject to ERAF, and that number is changing with every single calculation that we do. And so it's like anything else in budgets. In every budget I've ever produced, you produce the budget, the ink isn't dry, and I just got a new piece of information that
That's
will
like COVID.
change something, right?
We've been doing that for 2 years.
Seriously, right? So that is what budgeting is. We live with the world that we know that a budget is a living document and that every day I'm going to have a new piece of information. We hope that we've always picked up on those things that are going to be material. There's no way that anybody could have second guessed this. So as it is, you're quite a ways ahead of when that impact actually hits you. So, you're not going to be adopting your budget for next year. And by that time, we're going to start getting new property tax estimates in February that are going to change that picture completely going forward. If your tax rate in the current year bumps up to 5%, guess what that does to your property taxes and all of the rest of the years, right? So, so I would say, really kudos to Chris for being able to wrap his head around this so quickly. But I don't know how it could have been determined any sooner. It would be lovely if we lived if everybody was perfect all the time. I would like to be perfect. I would like it never to get a number wrong. And I know that that's not realistic. So we all do our best. We have a lot of different people review in order to do our best. And so.
Quick follow-up on that one. Given that normally, again, it's my understanding that after we approve, because we do eventually need to get to an action this evening. So normally when we approve these reports and then we send them to the county and the county reviews them and then we get a letter that certifies and blah, blah, blah. Given the nature of where we are now, would it be reasonable to expect we've done our best with the time frame that we have? Should something else show up that will work in conversation before we get those letters saying that you have a materially different blah, blah, blah? Yeah?
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you.
So number one, I've already taken a quick look at your multi-year projection. I don't have any issues off the bat with your numbers. Chris and I work very, very closely on these LCFF numbers, so no issue there.
Okay.
We will definitely make comment about the change in the letter, because again, it's another communication tool that we would hope that you can also use with your public. And so, we always hope to see those letters on board agendas so that they have become public documents. And we can certainly, I will be starting to think about this whole concept of basic aid and how people take it. So I'll start to think about some language to help educate that this doesn't mean that we're overnight rich. And then please also be aware that we always send those letters to your superintendent and your CBO before we ever mail them out. We would never want to mail a letter to the board president without the superintendent and the CBO having an opportunity to have a look at it and make comment. And indeed they do that. So.
Thank you.
Right?
Are we bringing this back to us?
We are. That's what we're doing right now. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thorough. You know your stuff. I know you know your stuff. Between the two of you, I think we're going to be fine. I think my biggest concern is optics. I think my biggest concern is communication. 95% of the problems can be alleviated with proper communication. In this case, an error was made. I mean, it's math. I mean, if the LCFF is 62% of our budget and the parcel tax is 15, that's 70, over 3/4 of our whole budget comes from these two things, right? So, and these two things are kind of jacked up right now. And in fact, we don't really know. One is a moving target with the taxes, the property taxes, and certainly this is 62% of the LCFF. So it's a big deal. This is a big thing. We can't pretend that this isn't a big thing, but with proper communication and, you owning the little piece that allows us to say, hey, this is our hiccup, because at the end of the day, this wasn't anything you did. And I think that's super important, because in our side of the dais here, people love, in my long attention here, watching what happens, people just like to sit back and take pop shots at us and then go back to what they do. And they just say, oh, they don't know what the hell they're doing over there, they're just running, and then that gets out.
Yes.
And then this group is constantly trying to weather a public opinion storm, whether it's true or not, and certainly with an adversarial charter relationship, they exacerbate those and they fan those flames, like we don't know what we're doing and all this stuff. And so I think by having some really good communication of what we've learned, and truthfully, I don't think the majority of the people out there are driven to understand this at the level that certainly you do, and certainly we have been informed. But it would be really nice to have this in the front end in order, because nothing that we have done here has been necessarily due to our lack of diligence in doing the work correctly. And then I think that would be my biggest thing to work together on, is the optics. And then I think the community would be really interested to know, and I think a lot of the communities are going to be very interested to know that they're paying for money that for people that may not be in their areas, and I think it's going to affect a lot more than just us. I think that this story is a lot bigger than just us, and I think that that's got to work its way through. But it was very thorough. Very grateful for your time.
I'm going to do one more, going back out to the public for any comment before we come back here for final discussion and action, and see if there's any other public comments or questions that anybody wants to put in. All right, seeing none, I also want to turn to Sue-Ann to see if you have any final questions for tonight.
No, I don't, and thank you for answering the questions posed. I did kind of jump in, but I will have other questions,
Okay.
and I would love to submit with the board's questions.
Okay, and we will definitely send us your questions as well, and we will follow up
Great.
with that. All right, is there anyone else, any other discussion or questions that we want to put out?
My question's gonna wait.
Okay.
One of mine as well.
Yeah.
Then it sounds like, as I said, we do need to take action tonight, and taking action, the agenda item is a recommended approval, and so taking action in terms of approval with an understanding that we clearly have considerations and questions and that kind of stuff, so that we may need to have another agenda item to address these before we get to the second interim, to come back on these. So just understanding that we do have an approval action, but we can also advise to come back with answers.
I'm ready to make a motion. Yeah, so I make a motion to approve the 21-22 first interim budget report as presented today by Chris Carson.
I'll second.
I'd make just a friendly, it's not really an amendment to the motion, but a direction to staff to collect all of the questions and then to come back for another agenda item on just updating us on answers and inform us on questions, maybe bringing Kate Lane if we need her back, or so it's not an amendment to the approval, it's just a
Sure.
friendly staff direction amendment.
Or women
Great.
savings.
Yep. Okay, so we've got a motion and a second, and
Sure.
we'll just go ahead and do a roll call vote on that motion and second to approve with the staff direction to bring back. So, Marie?
Aye.
Aye.
Wesley? Shelley? Aye.
Rachel, I.
Ryan?
Aye.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so
One
much.
in the book.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you for being prepared to sit through this. I thought, oh my goodness, I can't believe the poor Ross Valley Board. We're going to go through ERAF and the INLU and LCFF, so thank you.
We can
thank
do
you,
it.
Thank
It's
you.
important.
Thank you, Kate, for.
Very much
Thank you.
appreciated.
Thank you very much, Kate, for coming.
Yes, and I'm noticing it is 9:20, so I want to just take a moment, a 5-minute break.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was gonna
And
ask.
then after that, so I can assess
Use
our
the bathroom real
timing,
quick.
and then after
Yeah,
that, we
I
can
just
kind
need
of
to
figure out how
move
much
it.
time we're
Just
gonna
like-
need.
Lower back.
So we'll take a 5-minute break.